everyone, I'm Kimberly from Dirt Floor Fibers, and I'm really excited about today's project. Today we're going to be trying some ice dyeing. Now, if you saw my last video in which I unboxed the June 2021 Fiber of the Month Club from Paradise Fibers, you would know that I got some new acid dyes as well as some silk roving in that package. And so today we are going to get that all dyed up. Now, I've never actually done ice dyeing before. I've always kind of been interested in the technique, but it's one of those things that you really have no control over your final product. You spread some ice over some roving, add some powdered dyes over the top of that, and then as the ice melts, the dye moves down through your yarn or your roving and it mixes in whatever pattern it feels like. So every single time you do it, you're going to get a new result, regardless of how well you set it up the same way each time. So I usually try to go for colorways that are a little more repeatable, but this is going to be a really fun experiment today, so I'm super excited. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn you around and you can see what my setup looks like. All right, so you can see I have a tub underneath with a cooling rack sitting on top. I had a hard time finding one that fit really well, but this one seems to be doing the job. On top of that, I have my silk roving laid out. This is a mulberry silk, and I did kind of pull the roving apart and flatten it a little bit just because I wanted a nice surface for my ice to sit on, and I figured that way I could get the most amount of surface area exposed to the dyes as possible. Now, this roving did soak overnight in a water and vinegar mixture. You could also probably use citric acid and that would work just fine. I did let it sit overnight though, because silk does take a while to fully saturate with the water. So just putting it in your sink for 20 minutes like you would with wool probably is not going to be enough with this. I also have myself a 10-pound bag of ice. I don't know that I'll use all of it, but that's what I had from the grocery store. And then I also have these little samples of the new acid dyes from Paradise Fiber. According to the package, there's about half a teaspoon of powder in each one of these, and they gave me a yellow, a magenta, and a turquoise, so that'll be nice to use. Those primary colors will blend and make some really nice secondary colors, so that'll be interesting. And then the other thing that I don't have shown here, but I'm also going to be putting on a dust mask, just because when you're working with powdered dyes, you know, they're not really toxic, but they do have fine particulates, which you can accidentally breathe in, which if you're doing a lot of dyeing, you don't want to be breathing all of that in on a regular basis. So I'm gonna go ahead and put on my mask and start adding some ice to the top of my roving. Okay, so I think I like the way I have my ice set up. I tried to get it as close to the edge of the roving as I could. I don't really mind if I do have some white left in my rovings. I think that'll make a really nice contrast, so I'm not too fussed about the edges. And I do think as the ice melts, it will drip nicely onto those edge pieces. I am trying to keep the ice a little bit in from the edge of the bucket though. I am dyeing outside, however, I don't want to make a huge mess, so we'll see how that goes. So I did use, probably about 2/3 of my 10-pound bag of ice on the top here. All right, so now I'm going to open up my acid dyes, and I'm just going to sprinkle them over the top. I think what I'm going to do is put a stripe of yellow on this side and on this side, and then put my magenta and my blue in the middle, and then, or my turquoise in the middle, and then that way all the colors will get a chance to mix with one another. So let me go ahead and do that. All right, that was really messy. I spilled a little bit. I think I to put everything into the cap instead of the correct side, but we'll just be super careful as we're spreading. I don't feel like I'm getting very good coverage with this yellow. That's just on the roving, not even on the ice. Ugh, this is a mess. All right, let's see what I can do with the blue or turquoise. Alright, that seems to have worked a little bit better. Now let me switch around my magenta so it's not in the cap. Yeah, definitely wear old clothes and your dust mask. It's a little bit breezy outside, and my dye is going everywhere. Alright, better than the yellow, not quite as good as the turquoise. But that's what it looks like all set up. And I think I'm going to go ahead and move this into my gazebo. It's not going to get as much direct sunlight, but they are predicting a storm later. So I want to make sure this doesn't get rained on. Alright, so I'll go ahead and move this. I'm going to go run some errands, and I'll check back in a few hours. Now I have to admit, when I started this project 7 hours ago, I was not entirely convinced. It was really hard to get the dye powder to go exactly where I wanted it to go. I ended up with dye powder all over me, my camera, my deck. That was not fun. I was also a little bit worried about the amount of extra dye that I knew I was going to lose as the ice melted and just dripped through the roving. But now that it's gotten a chance to kind of sit and melt for a while, the results are pretty interesting. Let me turn you around and you can see what I'm talking about. So these are the results after sitting outside for about 7 hours. You can see that all the ice has melted away, leaving behind this really neat, almost tie-dyed pattern on the top of the roving. Now I'm not surprised that I didn't get a lot of bright yellow areas. I did have a lot of trouble getting that dye powder to spread out evenly along the edges. However, I had a lot more success with the magenta and the turquoise. We've got some really great areas where you can see the different colors have blended together, the blue and the yellow to make green, some areas of purple between the magenta and the turquoise, and these really fun kind of red and orange areas along the side as well. Now I do have some areas, you can kind of see right here and a little bit back here, where the dye powder is still sitting on top of the roving. It didn't really mix and melt in. Now, according to the instructions that came with my Fiber of the Month Club items, I'm supposed to just go inside and rinse this under cool water until the water runs clear. However, I'm just a little bit worried that perhaps the colors haven't set yet. It was a pretty warm day, but not boiling water warm. And because I was worried about storms coming through, I did let this sit underneath my gazebo, which is covered, so it didn't get all of the direct sunlight either. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop the roving over into my steamer pot and just let it steam on the stove for maybe, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, just to make sure everything has been properly set. Then I'll give it a rinse and we'll see what we are dealing with. Now I'm also going to play with the leftover dye. Now, hopefully I don't drop that. That would be horrible. Now you can see in the bottom of my bucket, I do have a fair amount of water and dye left. And I knew that was going to happen simply because it was going to drip through the roving and out the bottom. Did make me a little bit sad, but I'm wondering if I can reuse this. I'm going to tear off a piece of paper towel and dip it in and see what color it comes out. Alright, it looks like a really nice dark blue. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump the water that's still in this bucket into one of my dedicated dye pots, and I'm going to dye some roving with this leftover color. And that way, nothing gets wasted. So I'll go ahead and do both of those projects, the steaming of the silk roving as well as the dyeing of some other roving, and I'll show you what that looks like when it's all finished. I am back with the results of our ice dyeing experiment. Now I did end up taking my silk roving inside and steaming it on the stove for about 40 minutes. I was hoping that would just help get that extra powder that hadn't dissolved set into the roving as much as possible. And then I also took that extra dye that was left over in the bucket. I put it on the stove, heated that up with some vinegar, and I also took about 100 grams of Corriedale Cross roving, soaked that in a mixture of vinegar and water for about 20 minutes, and then I dip dyed that into that leftover dye. And let me tell you, there was a lot of dye there. So let me show you my roving. It's still drying, it's pretty wet. I'll tell you why in a moment. So you can see how saturated those colors came out. The purple is from the end that I started with, and then ended up with this lighter kind of teal, blue, turquoise, really pretty color. It'll make a great gradient when it's spun up. However, I don't think this is going to be a piece that actually makes it into my shop. So I'll tell you why. This, even though it's so dark, did not exhaust all the dye that was left over. I actually had to take a skein of leftover yarn that's from a base that I didn't end up carrying, so it had nylon in it. And you can see I also dip dyed that. This came out okay. I might re-dip dye it from the other end just to get a little bit more color. I did do this one dry without any vinegar on it, so my end fade wasn't quite as nice as I would have liked it to have been. So the extra dye did 100 grams of roving plus 100 grams of yarn. And I had the toughest time getting the turquoise dye to actually strike and set. So the silk roving, I ended up having, after I steamed it, I let it cool, rinsed it out, had so much blue dye come off of it. I had a little bit of yellow, but I kept rinsing and rinsing and rinsing, and the blue dye just kept coming out of it. So I ended up getting as much as I could. There's just a little bit of pale blue in the water. I figured, you know, I'm gonna spin it up, I'll wash it again, it'll be fine. Well, I hung it up to dry, went back to squeeze out a little bit more water later, and it came out bright blue again. So I ended up rinsing it some more, and then I let it soak in vinegar and water. That seems to have taken care of the bleeding problem with the silk. The roving, however, I cannot get the blue dye to strike. It was in almost boiling water. It was actually boiling at one point. I thought I was gonna felt the fiber by accident when I was dyeing it. It was in that water on either a boil or just under a boil for well over an hour, still not set. I washed it, used soap, used water, I soaked it in another cool water and vinegar wash, still have blue coming out of it. So I'm actually gonna take it back inside and try to steam it one more time. And if that doesn't set the blue dye, then I'm just gonna have to throw it away, because there's no way anyone can either spin with that fiber or use it in a knitting project once it's spun up if we can't get the blue dye to strike. Now, considering that I used a boatload of vinegar, it was on the stove on way too hot a heat for way too long, it's been rinsed, it's been washed, it's gotta be the blue dye. I have, like, the other two colors were fine. The little bit of yellow that came out of the silk roving I think was just extra dye powder that was on the top. Didn't get any magenta coming out of it. The turquoise is horrible. So I think I'm probably not going to be switching over to the Paradise Fibers acid dyes anytime soon. The stuff I already use seems to be much better, and it strikes under conditions that it's supposed to strike in. But I'll go ahead and show you the silk roving. Now I am glad that silk doesn't felt because I did have to be pretty rough with it when I was washing. But this is the final result. The colors are absolutely gorgeous. It's like an impressionistic painting. I love how it all came together. It does still have the white spaces, but rather than being sad about that, I feel like it makes the other colors really pop without being too overwhelming. So this silk is absolutely gorgeous, and I can't wait to spin this up. I still think I'm gonna go with the embroidery thread to see if that works. I don't usually spin quite that thin. I do like lace weight though, but we'll check it out and see how it works. So my final review of ice dyeing. It seems like a really fun project on a hot day in the summer if you just want something fun to do. I would maybe just use Kool-Aid or food coloring though, instead of the good acid dyes, just in case the result isn't quite what you expect it to be. There is also a lot of leftover dye at the end of the process, so unless you want to do like a leave no dye behind, extra skein or extra roving in it, just using food coloring or Kool-Aid would probably not be as sad to have that extra dye get left over. So go ahead and try it out for yourself. Let me know how it goes in the comments below.